they got me in a chair, handcuffed already behind my back. And he says, we know that you're the boss and that he's the mule. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because I was raised in the United States, right? You're innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And he's like, what do you think? We're stupidos? And he snaps his finger, and the guy goes out of the room and comes back in with a manila envelope, pulls out 2 black and white pictures of me at the Milwaukee airport with my attorney, who's handing me an envelope, which was full of like $300,000.
Mm.
Art, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Got a good feeling about this one.
Yeah. How's your time been in Austin so far?
Great. I was at the poolside today. It was very relaxing. I haven't been outside poolside for a while.
We heard that you got yourself a nice suite at the Otis Hotel.
It's a very nice room.
Yeah.
It's a nice hotel, actually.
Gets the job done.
It does.
Yeah. Well, Harry and I are both very excited for this conversation. We got connected through our mutual friend, Adam von Rothfelder, founder of Strong Coffee Company. So thank you, Adam, for setting this episode up. And he called me when he was pitching why you should come on the show. And he was basically saying, this guy's life story is so unbelievable that when I tell you these things, you're not going to believe it, but it's all true. And so we come to find out that you just published a book, Poison for Rats, which is this incredible biography about all the crazy turns and events and things that have happened throughout your life to shape you into the person that you are now. And the more Harry and I were learning about your story, we were literally blown away. Number one, that you're still alive. And number two, it seems like you've lived almost 9 lives in one life too. So I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting takeaways and learnings for our audience. But I think to kick things off, I think just, if we can learn a little bit more about kind of where you were when you grew up, coming from Milwaukee, and kind of take the story from there, and we'll ask questions along the way. That would be great.
Well, I think I had a sort of a typical upbringing of Midwestern in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think if you mention it to most people, would think of it as, a beer town. There was Blatz and Schlitz and Pabst, Miller. So I grew up in this town. There was a lot of blue-collar factory, beer town, blue-collar town, hard-working people town. And I grew up, when I used to watch TV on Saturday mornings, there was several shows on Saturday morning, and one of them was the Howdy Doody Show, which most people wouldn't know what that was, but it was a show with a host whose name was Buffalo Bob, and then there were guests. They had kids in a peanut gallery, and it was pretty cool. And then after that came a show called Soldiers of Fortune, 2 guys in safari suits, and they were hacking their way through the jungles of South America. And every week there'd be some, new story they got into. That was followed by Tarzan. It was an interesting show about, here's a white guy who can actually converse with the animals. No black people converse with, no Africans. It was only this one white guy who could swing around and talk to the chimps and the lions, and that was interesting. Then there was Flash Gordon, a space traveler who had a really good-looking woman named Dale, and every planet they landed on one planet called Mongo, and the Mongo, there was Emperor Ming. Ming was the Emperor of Mongo. And every week on the series, he'd be like kidnapping this Dale, and then he'd have her on some kind of a cement altar, and then there'd be like lions in a pit, and you were led to believe he wanted to take this really good-looking hot chick and throw her in a pit full of lions, when today it would be a completely different show. But Flash would come in and rescue her, and the characters like on the starship, right? So long story short, my father was a furniture salesman, and he would take the bus home, and I'd go to the bus stop. I'd walk to the bus stop as a young boy and meet my dad getting off the bus, and I really didn't want to have that kind of life. I don't know why. I just imagined that the life that I saw in these TV shows was the life I'd like to have. And I think that I went out of my way to live out of an imaginatory state of mind and fantasize Just like those shows were actually made out of several guys who, own the movie studios that did these TV shows. They created the Picket Fence and Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and all these shows out of their imagination that this is America, and they sold the American dream. They just made it up. They were immigrants from Germany and Austria. But anyway, so I really lived the life out of my imagination and didn't feel that I really belonged in the environment that I grew up in, and so I tried to do other things which weren't very acceptable. In school, thought I was very funny. I remember one time I was trying to be a ventriloquist and throwing my voice and lifting the top of the desk up, and I just couldn't understand how the teacher knew where the voice was coming from that I would try to throw across the room. And in those years, a special needs kid, there was no special needs services, so you were just labeled as a bad kid, and I was kind of put in the coat room and the principal's office. Anyway, I didn't last too long in school. It was 10th grade before I had been suspended so many times that I was in 3 different high schools, and 10th grade was the end of my education. And that's when I started hanging out at this place called Mark's Big Boy, which was a diner kind of restaurant that really during the day when other kids my age were in school, I would sit there with guys that were 15 and 20 years older. They were siding salesmen. They were ticket scalpers. One guy was an Italian guy who was supposedly connected, who was a fence. He would, say, hey, anybody need coats or clothing? You go to his house and his basement was full of racks of clothing from the robbery you saw on the news the night before. And these are all mentors of mine. And it was a good influence because they were entrepreneurial. I remember one guy said to me, Joe Solacek, we call him the Schmutz, because he always had something either on his mouth or on his tie. Joe was like 300 pounds. He talked like this. He would say, Artie, you want to go with me today? And I got into his Cadillac with him and a guy named Ronnie Plotkin, and they went to a house. They were siding salesmen. So they go to a house, and Ronnie gets out of the back and lifts the trunk and puts a tripod on the front lawn of the house with a camera, and Joe goes to the front door and just says, you're my kid. You're out of school today. You're my kid. Just sit quiet. And the woman answers the door, and he shows the woman, credentials that he's with Life magazine. He's got a little press pass that says Life magazine, and he shows her a Life magazine article about a home redo. They redid this home. It was featured in Life, and he said, your home needs to be redone, and if you're willing to do it, we'll feature it in Life, and you get 50% off. And she calls her husband, Fred, come here. And next thing you know, we're in the living room on the sofa at the coffee table. And at the end of an hour, we get back in the car, and he's got a check for $2,500. Now, this is 1966. And he looked at me and goes, successful guys, Artie, are done at noon. And now we golf. And that was one of my mentors. And years later, I actually had a press pass created called Syndicated News International, where I just created my own company and went to the local printing office and it was called Lieberman Printing, Leo Lieberman, and had the press pass printed. And I can't tell you how many times I got in backstage to see acts and, never had to pay for acts, hung out with the bands and was invited afterwards to their rooms. And everybody that you could think of. And that was when I was about 17. And I was a musician at the time, and I was in a band. I didn't know how to play guitar. I thought I did, but I didn't. The lead guitar player that I auditioned to be in this group said, you don't know how to play. So he said, you'll be the bass player, because he could show me 3 notes that he could teach me, because I had the feeling. So I got in this band because my father would drive us to the jobs. And I played bass in this band. it was pretty interesting. I used to go to a little tavern in the inner city, like all the black population in the inner city, and I'd watch this black group that was fabulous, like rhythm and blues. It was like the James Brown kind of thing. And the lead singer's name was Twistin' Harvey. And Twistin' Harvey would get up there and do these moves just like James Brown. And I wanted to be just like that, except I was kind of a little chubby Jewish kid from the suburbs. So I thought, well, what are we going to do? We got to step it up a little bit. So me and the lead guitar player, we figured it out that I would, sometime after the first or second set, because we were playing at bar mitzvahs and people's basements and things like that, I would take my pants off and be wearing like a diaper and call myself Bouncing Baby Artie. And so we took a pillowcase and had these big, I don't know if you ever saw them, but they're like kind of play safety pins that you could sometimes see in a novelty store. And I had the safety pins with this pillowcase, and I would do the thing. And we got booked every week. Then they started booking us in Madison. Now, Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Madison, they loved to have that kind of thing because everybody was really getting fucked up on beer in those days. It was kegs of beer. That's what people got high on. So they would get high on the kegs of beer, and then during the second act, they'd take my pants down and dance around the stage, and girls would rush the stage and tear the thing off. And we were making $1,000 a night. We were 4 kids. And none of us were even driving yet. My dad had to drive us. I got taken out of one of those gigs one night. It was about 10 below zero, naked. The Madison police had heard about the lascivious behavior, so they were ready. And when the diaper got ripped off, they carried me out like a dolphin. And my dad had to go to the police station to get me out. But anyway, those were some of my early upbringing days. And then I got into martial arts because I always wanted to be a tough guy. I wasn't a tough guy, but I wanted to be a tough guy. I don't know why I wanted to be a tough guy, but it seemed like tough guys were somebody you wanted to be. So I started taking martial arts, and I got involved with a group in Chicago that was the leader of this martial arts school was really one of the most well-known and respected karate masters, at least in this country for sure. And so I got involved with martial arts, and I had the band, and I wasn't in school. So kind of put all those things together, I would go to Chicago and study martial arts 3 days a week, and drive down there in my 1963 Chevy Biscayne. And then I would come back, and then I played in the band like 3 or 4 nights a week. By that time, we were already in a nightclub. And then I started doing a Bob Dylan thing because I love Bob Dylan. And as I was doing the Bob Dylan thing, it was at coffee houses. And it was right when beatniks were turning into hippies. You guys, probably most people wouldn't know what beatniks were, but beatniks were the precursors to hippies. And the big difference that I thought really was noticeable was at the end of a song, beatniks would click their fingers, snap their fingers instead of applauding or anything. So I would do these coffee houses, and Bob Dylan was, relatively unknown, but he had a couple of songs that were out that he was known as a writer. The Byrds had done Mr. Tambourine Man. It was a big hit. And I think Peter, Paul, and Mary did Blowing in the Wind. So you heard of Bob Dylan as a songwriter, much like other songwriters who became popular with other artists doing their material. But in these days, I love doing that music. For some reason, he spoke to me. And I wasn't a singer. I was a club act, but my voice was a lot like Bob Dylan. So I could do Bob Dylan songs really well. And I had a friend named Bert Synagogue, and Bert worked in the local guitar and musical instrument store, and he kept telling me, "You sound just like Bob Dylan. We could book you as Bob Dylan and make some money." I'm like, really? Yeah. We'll book you as Bob Dylan. So he rents the hall, the Milwaukee Repertory Theater, and another place in a place called Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And literally, people bought tickets to see Bob Dylan. And I walked out on stage, and I had the hair, and I had sunglasses on, and I had my dad's Pendleton from like 1950 on, and harmonica holder up, and he had one blue spotlight on me, and so I'm on. I'll never forget it. I was really nervous about the whole thing, and there was a couple thousand people in the audience, all thinking they were seeing Bob Dylan. And the disc jockey from the area was to introduce me, and so backstage he came up to me with an album under his arm and asked me to sign the album, and I thought for sure, this is it. He's 24 inches away from me. He's going to know I'm not Bob Dylan. But in the days before MTV, people really didn't know what anybody looked like. It was just top 40 radio. You heard the song played, you became familiar with it, but you didn't know who people were. And Bob Dylan's first album was a picture of him walking down a street in New York with hand in hand with I don't know if it was Joan Baez, but with a woman, and it was from a distance. So anyway, I got up and did this show. And in those days, there was no credit cards. I know this sounds really strange.
It does. So it was all cash.
It was all cash. So Bert went to the box office and got all the cash, and we fled in my 1963 Oldsmobile Cutlass out the back at the end while the standing ovation was taking place. And then we did it again, and somebody the second time must have seen that Bob Dylan was on tour somewhere, and how could he be at this place tonight? So, we got a phone call from the manager of Bob Dylan saying, that if we actually appeared, the police would arrest us and stuff. And so,
But the loophole was that you were Milwaukee's Bob Dylan, right? That's what you guys would say?
well, that's what we thought would be if we ever, really got into legal problems, was Milwaukee's Bob Dylan was on the poster. But, Bob Dylan was from Minneapolis, from someplace in Minnesota, some little town. People didn't know where he was from.
Yeah.
So that's how we did it. It was, but we didn't get in trouble for that. But that was the end of my career of Bob Dylan.
Did you have a sense that you were doing things differently, or after you graduated or moved on from high school, did you have a feel that you were on a different path than what other people would call normal?
Yeah, I would say definitely I did. People would make bets about things, and then I would do them. We'd sit around Big Boy Restaurant at 10 o'clock at night with some of my own age group guys that were in high school, and then they would bet $20 that I wouldn't run naked down Capitol Drive, which was the main thoroughfare. This was before anybody knew about streaking. And so, 5 guys came up with $20. It was $100. And that kind of thing, Everybody was getting drafted to go to Vietnam, and all these guys were joining, it was some type of, I forget what it was called, but you join the military, but you only, if you're in college, if you enroll for college, you only have to go once a month for a weekend. I forget what it was called, but they all did that. And I said, no, I'm going to get out. And they were all betting, everybody was betting that Rapkin isn't going to get out. And what I did was I put a loaded .38 Smith & Wesson in a shoulder holster and put a light jacket on over it and went to the Milwaukee Mental Institution at 11 o'clock at night and said I was depressed and I wanted to kill people. And it was 11 o'clock at night, and I said I came here for help. And they said, well, you have to wait till 8 in the morning when the psychiatrist comes in. And I'm like, okay. So they had me sitting on a couch in in the lobby or something. And then they came down and got me, and they said, we're going to go up to the second floor or third floor or something, because you're going to stay overnight. We want to make you comfortable. Oh, okay. So I go up to the third floor. I get up. Now we're at like a nurse's station, and they've got clothing for me. And they're saying, and I didn't know any of this was going to really happen. And they're saying, well, you have to put these on. It's kind of the policy or whatever. So, I take off the jacket, and I got the 38 snub nose in the shoulder holster, and I pull it out, and everybody is hitting the walls, and I put it down. And long story short, the next day the psychiatrist sees me, and I'm telling her that they see, by the way, in my wallet that I have my identification about having, a black belt in karate. And in those years, if you had a black belt, people assumed you had to have a license, like your hands were licensed as deadly weapons. So she's got this guy in front of her that wants to kill people, and she's asking me why, and I'm like, well, I want to rip out some eyes, tear off some tests. I can't wait to see the gooks. I'm going to go to Nam. Can't wait. But I wanted to get started here just to try some things out, So she's like, no, you're going to have to stay here for a couple of days. We'd like to keep you here. And I'm like, I don't want to stay here. I was sitting in the TV room waiting for the psychiatrist, and the TV was covered in chicken wire. And I thought, why is it covered in chicken wire? And then someone got out of a chair and rushed the TV to slam their head through it. And I could see why it was covered with chicken wire. There's people against the wall. They were going like this and drooling. And then somebody next to me in a wheelchair was kind of making grunting noises and reaching for the table where there were some magazines. So I gave him a magazine, and the next thing you know, I heard this noise. I turned, and he was shoving the pages into his mouth. So I'm in the psychiatrist's office, and I'm thinking, this isn't a place I want to spend a couple days. I just wanted to do this so that it would be on my record when I went in for the induction, that they would see that I was a little out there, right? She said, no, you have to stay here. I'm like, well, you can't keep me here. She's like, well, don't you think we have enough people here, security, to keep you here? And these guys all of a sudden show up with the white uniforms. And I said, well, okay, but who's going to go home without an eyeball tonight? So long story short, they called the sheriff's department, and the sheriffs came. 3 sheriffs, one with a shotgun. And anyway, they convinced me that they didn't want any trouble, that I should just go into the room where they had led me to. And the room was down a hall where they had all metal doors with slots, and only one metal door was open. And we're standing in front of the metal door, and I could see that it was like a cot with restraints on it. And I'm like, I don't want to go in there. And the sheriff said to me, listen, we can't go home and just say you scared us. You're going to have to go in there. Please, Art, just come on. Okay. So I go in there. It was about 3 hours goes by. The door opens and this gal comes in. The gal comes in and she's got this chrome pitcher in her hand. I thought, wow, that's water. I'm really thirsty. But instead she lifted up the sheet and put my penis in there in case I had to urinate. And at that time I recognized her and I'm like, Jackie? She's like, Art, what are you doing here? It turns out that, I was there with a false ID. I was only 17. My ID said I was 21 because I wanted to get in the bars and had access to a phony ID I bought from somebody at the Big Boy restaurant. And Jackie was a girl that I picked up in this bar and went home with, who was 23. And she's like, what are you doing here? And so I told her, you gotta call my dad. So she called my dad, and 2 hours goes by. My dad comes with an attorney and tells the psychiatrist, the guy's only 17. He can't sign himself in. We're taking him. So they had to release me. And then 7 months later, when I went down for my induction, I was in a room with about 20 other guys, all of which were trying to act completely flamboyantly gay. And every one of them went to see the psychiatrist because it was at the end after your whole physical. Every one of them came out going, and they were inducted. And I was the last one to go in, and I was wearing a light-colored blue jeans and a little sweatshirt, and I had short hair. I didn't look like the Stones or the Beatles, like everybody else looked. I looked like everybody wanted their kids to look like. And I was this all-American guy, and I went in there, and I just never looked at the guy in the face. I looked at the ground and just looked very disturbed. I had stayed up for 2 days before going there. And he's like, well, I have to tell you, Art, we're not going to take you right now. And I pounded on the table real loud and said, what? And looked at him, and he's like, don't get upset. We can't spend the kind of money in the military to train you and then have you turn on your commanding officer if he asks you to get down and do 26 push-ups. Because you could turn. And if you turn, you're a deadly guy. So we're going to not take you right now. I want you to continue to get help, and maybe in 9 months we'll bring you back in. You get to go. They never called me again. So I go back to Big Boy, and they're like, what? Collecting all the money. All these guys had to join whatever it was called, officers training, or,
So your plan worked.
It did.
So you always had this kind of like entrepreneurial, think outside the box mindset. It sounds like you were very street smart.
Well, while other kids were in high school and I was kicked out, I was being mentored by guys that were older than me that were street smart.
Yeah.
And that really was my education. And I got away with it. If you don't get away with something the first time, you probably won't do it again.
Mm-hmm.
If you get away with something, you probably will do it again.
Yeah.
And again and again. And I kept doing things and getting away with it. None of these things were harmful things to other people, really, but just kept getting away with it and feeling more confident. I didn't really realize that anyone can live out of their imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get it. I get it now after writing the book. I get really thinking about, well, why did I do these different things? What was the driver? And I really was kind of living out of the shows that had influenced me on television and the characters that influenced. I was very fortunate to be raised on that street with the Big Boy restaurant and being able to be around people that, I learned a lot from.
Yeah.
All my friends, when they got out of high school, then they went to college. And they still didn't know what they wanted to be when they graduated from college. Not that I knew what I wanted to be, but I don't know. I just wasn't, I wasn't really I didn't feel like I really belonged in what was considered to be a normal environment.
Hmm. Why do you think those guys brought you in? Because you were 15 years younger than them, right? Like I imagine it would have been easy for those guys at the diner to kind of just like not really pay much attention to you. But why do you think they kind of like brought you in and welcomed you in?
Well, I was always there. It was an interesting place to be. Instead of, in those years, there was no smartphones, there was no gaming, there was nothing to do at my house. So I would go where there was interesting people, and these guys were always there at 9, 10 in the morning, were the siding guys, were the, kind of street people. And at night I hung out with them too sometimes, and when I was able to get a phony ID, they taught me how to order drinks in a bar so nobody would ask me like my age or anything. Like don't order a fruity drink, order Jim Beam on the rocks. And then, at 17 you're drinking Jim Beam on the rocks because you're in the bar. So, I think I don't really know the answer to that question, but I feel that it was really fortunate that occurred.
Mm.
There was a lot of interesting people in Milwaukee where I lived at that time in the 60s.
Mm.
You could almost get anything done. Anything could happen in Milwaukee. It was like Chicago. And if you were involved with people who were illegitimate or did some criminal activities, that flourished there. So I picked up on a lot of that type of street smarts.
Yeah. So you're learning from these older guys. You're able to get out of the draft during Vietnam. What does that kind of next chapter of your life look like as you kind of enter your 20s?
Well, one of the guys in the Big Boy restaurant's name was Frank, and he was a Italian connected guy who was a fence. So anytime he would set up robberies, he had a pizza restaurant too, an Italian restaurant. So you'd be in there at night, and there'd be policemen in there, all eating for free. Well, Frank would make deals with the cops. Like, the cops would say, they were on a beat, and if he wanted to rob the first store, they wouldn't rush when the alarm went off.
Mm-hmm.
So Frank told me about a pharmaceutical manufacturing place where there was a lot of pills. I didn't know anything about it, but I was willing to go break in with another guy from New York who knew how to cut his way into the building through the alarm. So I went there, and we took his Mustang, 1965, I think, Mustang, and we went there, and we cut our way in. And the police officer on duty was not going to respond when the alarm went off, but we went in without setting off the alarm. And then we took out these huge, we filled garbage bags full of different prescription medications. And at the end, we couldn't get out the same way we got in, that little hole he cut. So he said, well, we're going to load it all onto a pallet, and we're going to forklift it, and you push the button on the door, and I'm going to drive it out. And because the police officer's not going to rush here, we'll be okay. So that's what happened, and he drives the forklift out, and then it tips over about 50 yards out into a field, and then we're trying to load up the vehicle with our stolen goods, and we never really considered that a 65 Mustang doesn't hold a lot. So we're ending up with our front seats into the windshield almost with all these bags of stuff. And of course, we sold all these pills. It was the first time that I ever actually saw any real money, because in the martial arts field, I had a karate school at the time, but there wasn't really any way to actually hardly pay my rent. So I wasn't making much money. I was making a little money in the band, and this pill thing kind of introduced me into the drug dealing world. And in the drug dealing world, I had a couple of friends who sold pot and LSD and so forth, and we'd play poker together. And there was these two guys, Steve and Sonny, and they would come into town on occasion and bring stuff that my friends, Howie and Tom, would sell, like hash, I think primarily hash, marijuana. They were smugglers, and they always had the best-looking clothes, and they had the best-looking women. And during one poker game, Steve, I said, I'd like to get into smuggling. And he's like, really? Well, South America. Go to South America. They got there's some drug down there, cocaine, that's not around here yet, but it's coming. It's going to be a big deal. And I'm like, oh. So I went to South America. I just went to South America.
No, you didn't have any connections?
I didn't have any connections. I went to South America and stayed at a hotel where nobody spoke English in Cartagena. And I asked the manager of the hotel in Broken, he understood some English. I said, I'd like to go to a marijuana cocaine farm, thinking it was legal in Colombia. And he was looking at me like, but the next night when I was having dinner in the hotel bar, he comes walking in with this guy, and he introduces him as Roberto. And he says, well, Roberto's a tour guide, and he'll take you out if you want to go out to nightclubs and stuff. I was with my girlfriend, and Roberto will take you out. And so, great, let's go out. So Roberto had a driver that I didn't know really was an assassin, but Roberto was in the passenger seat in the front, and me and my girlfriend were in the back, and we're driving. This is Cartagena, Colombia. It's like Miami, like the weather here, 87, humid, and we're driving down this beach road with palm trees, and He leans over, looks in the back seat, says, "Where are you from?" And I knew he wouldn't know where Milwaukee was, so I said, "Well, we're near Chicago." He says, "Oh, cold there, huh?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, it gets cold. It gets cold." Turns around, he goes, "Get snow there?" I said, "Oh, yeah, it snows there. We have snow here." I turned to my girlfriend. I'm like, "You kidding? Can you believe it? They have snow here?" She like elbows me and goes, "Not that kind of snow, you idiot." Next thing you know, we're in a nightclub, and some guy comes to the table he introduces me to, and he takes me to the men's room and opens up this little envelope, takes out a little white powder and sniffs it and gives me some and sniffs it. And that was my introduction to cocaine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the beginning of I guess it was right time, right place, dumb luck, because I didn't know what I was doing, but Roberto was really a tour guide, and he had never really done any sizable transactions. He would, if you wanted a gram or something because you were hanging out. But he asked me after I came back from the men's room with this guy if I wanted any, and I said, yeah. And he said, "Well, how much do you want?" And I said, "I don't know, a couple pounds." I didn't know he never was involved in anything like that.
Mm.
But he said, "Well, if you give me the money, I can go to Barranquilla," which was another city through the jungles. And I fronted him a couple of grand. And sure enough, the next day, he came back with some cocaine. And my girlfriend's father had a municipal and industrial chemical company. So they sold chemicals for cleaning, like the hospitals, hotels, gas stations. And part of what their line was aerosols. So it'd be bug sprays and stuff in aerosols. So I had investigated with him, when I went with him to Chicago to the manufacturing plant, these aerosol cans and how they were made. And so I got some Right Guard and Aquanet cans. You know what that is, Aquanet?
No.
It was a hairspray. See, back in the day when Right Guard was the first deodorant that was in an aerosol, there wasn't like a whole aisle of products. It was, you could get roll-ons, but if you wanted aerosol, there was Right Guard. So everybody who was buying the new thing was buying Right Guard. So I bought some Right Guard cans at the drugstore and some Aquanet hairspray, and I took an ice pick and stuck it through the top, and with the pliers, after all the aerosol came out, I pried the top off, and then from the can company in Chicago, I had all new tops. So what I did was I went to Colombia with these empty Right Guard and Aquanet cans, filled them full of cocaine, and then Elmer glued them back on full of cocaine, and that's how I actually came back and went through Miami Customs.
Wow. And that was the first few pounds that you ever imported, smuggled?
Yeah. And I did that for, several trips. I had actually brought my parents with me so we could have more Right Guard and Aquanet cans going back. I had my girlfriend's brother. It was like a family trip.
What were the nerves like when you were first coming back with your first batch to the U.S.?
My nerves?
Yeah.
I thought about that many times. I was nervous, but I don't know how I did it. I don't know how I did it. Because before you even got on a plane in Colombia, before there was the security that we know of today, they just had like armed army people searching everybody getting on the plane because they were really afraid of terrorism. In Colombia, there was terrorists. They were called FARC. To this day, I don't know what they were terrorizing about or what the whole thing was, but they were it was like Cuba when Castro came in and took over. They were terrorists, and so they were always watching for transporting of guns, that type of thing. So they would search you before you get on a plane, and then you get on the plane, and then you had a 3-hour trip back to Miami. And I had prepared myself by buying a briefcase, and on the briefcase, it wasn't fancy. I bought a stencil unit. You know what a stencil thing is? So I bought a stencil thing and I put Syndicated News International. I stenciled onto my briefcase, and I had my Syndicated News International press pass that I had used to get in the concerts and so forth. I used to have a radio show too, so I used that to interview different acts. And I had the syndicated news thing paper clipped to my passport. So when I went into customs and I only had a carry-on bag, I looked very clean cut in an environment where most people my age didn't look that way. And I'd put the bag down, and I was coming from Colombia. They weren't looking for cocaine. There was no cocaine in America. There was no cocaine problem. Nobody had even heard of cocaine. Now, if you were coming from Afghanistan or something, they were looking for heroin or hash. But coming from Colombia, there was no passport even required. All you needed was a driver's license to fly to Colombia and back, like in the old days. I don't know if it's still that way to go to Mexico, but we only needed a driver's license. So I'd come back to Miami Customs looking clean cut and just making it through. And then long story short, I would do the first trip was a couple of grand. After 12 weeks, I think I had $67,000 on my kitchen table. I took 60 grand, went back to Colombia. Next time I came back after 12 weeks, I had like 350 grand on my kitchen table. Went back there with 150 grand. And then I started making, $500,000, 2-3 times a year. And they still weren't really looking for cocaine. Matter of fact, the customs guys knew me by name. They'd see me getting my baggage and go, Art, like call me over to their place. You in Colombia again? Yeah, they always send young guys, news correspondents with the press pass, because I don't have any children, so they're always, making us travel more than the guys who have more of a home life. And did that for actually about almost 2 years, and then I started using other people as couriers. I had a nun who had a short leg, and she would walk like this with her nun outfit on. And then we went to a Halloween store and got if you wanted to be a priest for Halloween, and just hired a guy as a courier and dressed him up as a priest. So he was with the nun. They went through and carried. And then I was at such a level that we needed to bring in more. So I had a friend in Estes Park, Colorado, who had his mom who worked in a department store here in Dallas. And he said, I'm thinking about those cruises, the ones that leave like out of Fort Lauderdale and they go around for 10 days around the Caribbean. And I've got a tour guide in Cartagena, Colombia, which is right on the coast, which is a tour spot that they get off. And I think I could arrange to have everything there. And he said, I think my mom would be interested, because he knew I had been doing this and never had any trouble, didn't get caught. I was very successful. And we were both like 22, 23 years old. So I flew down here to Texas, met with his mom. She was making like $6,500 in a department store. And I offered her 5 G's and all expenses paid. And she was doing 3 cruise trips a year. And she had big suitcases on those 10-day cruises. So we made false tops, false bottoms. And the thing is, when they came back after being in, wherever they went in the Caribbean, whether Antigua, and then they went to Cartagena, and then they went to Panama, wherever they went, and then they came back. They never searched these people. They were all seniors. In those years, a lot of people didn't take cruises unless you were older, because they were expensive. And so usually it was an older group of people getting off that cruise, like 3,000 people getting off the cruise. All they had was T-shirts that they bought for their grandkids, maybe some jewelry. They never searched them. So we did that. We had a pretty large operation. By that time, Wisconsin, Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, and was moving a lot of, it was all wholesale, and I was nowhere near the product anymore. I was never with the product, and I was never with the money. So if we were doing business, you would have to take the money. Let's say you were going to buy a kilo for $55,000. You would go to my attorney's office with a locked briefcase and say, here's the closing documents for the Rapkin real estate matter. And my attorney would take the briefcase, call me on the phone and say, I got the closing documents. Then I would send Lily, who was the 63-year-old woman, to the hotel room, and you would go to the hotel room, and she would be in room 312, and she would hand you the closing documents in another briefcase, which was the cocaine. So there was never a time that I was with either the money or the cocaine. And if you and I ever got busted and you were on the witness stand, the defense could say, did you ever actually give Art Rapkin the money? No, I didn't. But I mean, I took it to his attorney. Yeah, but you never gave it to him, right? No, he never. Did he ever give you the cocaine? No, he never did. So, I mean, I had it kind of, in my own mind, I was pretty good, pretty safe. But I also had acquired a real habit for the cocaine. And I was addicted pretty much. But I was fortunate that I was able to always get myself together and straight when I went on I call it a mission, when I went on a trip.
Were you always using cocaine from the day that you started selling it, or was it you were just selling it and then you started using some of your own product?
I think, from the day I started using it, it was a very subtle thing because, before then I had done hallucinogenics, LSD, psilocybin, and, the type of high from cocaine was very subtle. And I think it was like that for a lot of people because it was easy to get addicted to something. Today it's Adderall. People take Adderall, they become the better version of themselves. It's hard to go back.
Give it to 10-year-old kids, right? Can't pay attention in school. It's legalized amphetamines.
I've never really taken Adderall, but I know people who take Adderall, and they act exactly like the people who take cocaine.
Yeah.
I mean, we got carried away where we were doing, injecting it IV because your nose just wore out. But it was a very naive time, I have to say. But people now think of it as in a different light than when I'm talking 1970 to 1975. You didn't know people whose lives were ruined by cocaine. You didn't know people who really destroyed whatever they had in a personal relationship or business that they had. You know what I mean? People hadn't gotten that destructive. So it wasn't until later that it became a destructive thing. I didn't really think of it as anything. I thought that it was like an outlaw thing to do. It was a cool thing to do, but I never really saw myself as a narcotics trafficker until the day I ended up in Mexican prison, being electrocuted, and tried to get me to sign a confession in Spanish that I was the boss of this operation. Then I realized this is a more serious problem. Being in Mexican prison, you realize, I'm not sure I want to be a criminal.
How did that happen? How did you get caught and thrown in jail?
The DEA was investigating me for a number of years. Let's say somebody came out of a club at 1 a.m. and they got stopped because they went through a red light or they had a headlight out or something. They got busted with cocaine. And then what would they say if they were asked, well, where did this come from? They would, well, there's this guy named Art, and he has a house. He lives in Colombia. He also lives on the top of the Rockies in Estes Park, and he's a smuggler. And Art Rapkin, Art. So they heard. I think that really is the way somebody got busted for something and then talked about it because it was a way to get out of it, right? So they had heard about it. Then they actually came to Estes Park, 2 intelligence agents from the IRS. Because remember, I never really made any money until I started making money. And at 20 years old, it didn't occur to me to start filing taxes just because I had money. So they actually came up to Estes Park. I had this house that was way off the beaten path, and they found it, and they pulled up, and there was a Citroen Maserati in the driveway and a Rolls Royce. And I was heating up some formula for my baby Josh, and the agents came to the door and showed me their credentials. And I thought, well, can we ask you a few questions? Yeah, sure. So I let him in, and then I handed him my baby while I was getting the formula, the bottle ready. And here's the IRS agent sitting there with my son Josh, and they were asking me questions like, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I have a little store on Main Street. It's called Marty's Candle Nook. It's like Estes Park is a tourist town, so it's got tourist stuff in it. And what about these cars?" "Well, I won that one in a poker game." I just thought, I'm outsmarting. Remember, I've been outsmarting people my whole life. So I'm figuring out just whatever comes out of my mouth. I didn't realize that you just don't talk to people like IRS agents, DE. You don't have to talk to them. You just say, "No, sorry, but you can't come in. You have to."
Yeah.
I want my lawyer present if there's any reason. But I didn't do that. I thought I'd be really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, I thought that I was really cool, and I probably was really cool because the IRS agent who was investigating me, they investigated for years. They were actually, these two guys, that was their whole gig, was investigating me and putting a case together. They would go to Braniff Airlines, which is no longer in business, Transworld Airlines. They saw how many times I went to Colombia. They tried to do a paper trail of how much, they went around Estes Park, they went into the drugstore and asked the pharmacist how much they spent. Trying to just put together a case that I made so much money but didn't pay taxes, didn't file taxes. So that's what they really had, was a case of 2 years failure to file with intent to invade. But they had really nothing about cocaine or trafficking. But I was doing I shouldn't have done it, but this guy that was my bodyguard, his father had cancer, and he wanted to help pay for his medical treatment, and he asked me if he could be a courier and if we could do one more trip. And my wife was like, "Don't do another trip. Don't." They were flying over our house in Sonoma in helicopters, photographing us at the pool. "Don't do it." And I thought, they're never going to catch the fox. So I get on a plane. I go down to Bogota with this guy. He's going to carry it back because he wanted to make $10,000 that I offered him that he could pay for his father's medical care.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it wasn't a cruise. And the idea was we were going to get it in Bogota, and he was going to fly to Mexico City, get off the plane in Mexico City, then have a domestic ticket to fly from Mexico City to Tijuana, where I had a car with people who was going to pick him up and come over the border at Tijuana in the San Ysidro border crossing, as if he was in Tijuana for Friday and Saturday. It was a good plan. So he landed in Mexico City. I was supposed to fly 2 hours after his flight left and go to Miami, but because we packed all this cocaine, we didn't have masks on. We didn't know about masks. And so all this powder, you inhaled it, and I was like, when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. So it was like, my flight was at 8 in the morning, and at 4 in the morning, I think I took 2 Valium. So I didn't make the flight. And the only flight that was flying out at 11 was the flight to Los Angeles that he was on that stopped in Mexico City. So I figured, well, I'm not getting off, and I have no drugs, so I'm going to go. So I got on that flight. I paid cash for my ticket at the counter in Bogota. I got on the flight. He's sitting next to me, and I'm like in 3A, and he's in 3B. Lands in Mexico City. He gets off the plane. He's got all the cocaine in these false suitcases. And I'm sitting there waiting for the plane to board more people and fly to L.A. I'm going to get off in L.A. And 2 guys get on the plane, and they said to me, "Hey, we're from Braniff Airlines, and you bought this ticket in Bogota, but you owe like $64. They mispriced it or something." And I'm like, "Oh, here. No, we can't take the cash from you on the plane. You have to come in and do it at the counter." And I did. I got off that plane. I have no drugs. And I go through customs, and I could see my courier going through, and he passed through customs. And the next thing you know, guys came out of nowhere, and they're taking him down a hallway, and they're taking me down the same hallway. I didn't know this, but we get into this little room, and they put the suitcases up on a table, and the next thing you know, they bring in a photographer that's from the Mexico City newspaper, and they stick like a Bowie knife through the suitcase and go like this and pull it out, and powder's falling out on the table. And I'm like, oh. And and they all of a sudden this guy comes in who's obviously like the commandante, and they got me in a chair, handcuffed already behind my back, and he says, you know, we know that you're the boss and that he's the mule. And I'm like, you know, what are you talking about? Because I was raised in the United States, right? You're innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
And he's like, what do you think? We're stupidos? And he snaps his finger, and a guy goes out of the room and comes back in with a manila envelope, pulls out 2 black and white pictures of me at the Milwaukee airport with my attorney, who's handing me an envelope which was full of like 300 grand. So they followed me from my house out in I lived in Sonoma, so I think I flew out of Oakland. They followed me to Milwaukee, the DEA. They were on the planes. They followed us to Bogota. They didn't know what hotel rooms and all that, but they knew I was on that airplane. And they figured we're not going to get him in the States because of the way he operates now, but we're going to get him here. And how are we going to get him here? They're going to torture you until you sign a confession. So they started electrocuting me right in the airport. They had a cattle prod. It started electrocuting me. They decided to take a piece off my finger. I wouldn't sign the confession. It was like a 5-page confession in Spanish. I wouldn't sign. I kept thinking, I don't have any drugs. I didn't know the DEA were watching. The guy said to me, he said, you think that we didn't know? Who do you think set this up? The DEA, they're watching right there. He pointed to the 2-way glass or whatever. I never signed the confession. So after about 3 days of being interrogated in the torture chambers, and the guy that I never saw again, who was the courier, was also interrogated. I figured he was signing the confession, right? I mean, what they did to me for 3 days, they hooked up an electric box with wires to your testicles.
Oh, my God.
They came in and poured cold water, like a bunch of water on you. You were naked, underground in like a dungeon. They poured cold water on you, and then they electrocuted you. And the only reason I didn't sign that confession really wasn't because I was so tough. It was because they said, if you sign, we'll stop this all. If you don't sign, one of these times you're going to pass out and not wake up. Your heart's going to stop, and we're just going to throw your file away, and no one's going to know what happened to you. And I figured, okay, because I was in this terrible room with a little hole in the floor where somebody else's feces was from the last guy, dried blood on the wall, and I thought, if I sign this thing, I'm going to be here 15 years or something. I'd rather just go and end it here. So I didn't sign it, but they lied to me, and they didn't kill me. And then I was transferred to this place called the Black Palace. It's Lecumberri prison. There's a lot of documentaries that were made on this prison. It was a hellhole, and I was put into this Lecumberri prison. And they kept me there for a year, the American government. I was supposed to go to court within 3 days. And if you had no drugs and no accusers, meaning if he never signed a confession either. Can you believe that?
That's
incredible. That's wild.
This guy never signed. And so
For 10K.
when we went to the court for our opening appearance, his statement, I read it, was that we went to Colombia for a karate tournament, and he was a karate student, and he went with me as the karate instructor, that I was being one of the judges of this tournament, and he went with me, and he did this whole cocaine thing on his own, and I didn't know anything about it.
Wow. Loyal.
That was his statement. And we were in there a year before we ever went for our final sentencing, a year. And during that year, I started shooting heroin in prison. There was guys that shot heroin every day. They'd come into my cell because nobody bothered me in my cell. And we would, like, all of us, 14, 12 guys, would take the same needle, sharpen it on the concrete floor, heat it up, and shoot intravenously heroin until, it was about 8 weeks I did that until I got so tired of who I had become. And I already injected cocaine, so addiction wasn't a new thing to me. But if you're in a Mexican prison and every day there's news that somebody else was found dead, I didn't think there was any hope. But there was other Americans incarcerated, but they had all signed confessions. Matter of fact, there were 636 Americans in various Mexican prisons in Mexico, and 632 had signed confessions. Wow. 4 people didn't sign confessions, me and the guy I was with, and 2 Puerto Ricans from New York who were really tough guys. They didn't sign confessions. And so at this time, politically, it was very interesting. You know, Nixon was out of office, and I think Gerald Ford was in and running for another term. Because, you know, Nixon he got kicked out, and then Ford took over. Anyway, Jimmy Carter was running for president, and Jimmy Carter was a human rights activist, this peanut farmer from Georgia. So me and a couple of other guys smoking pot said, wait a second. People in America don't realize that all these people, these Americans and Canadians that were young kids. I mean, I deserved to be there. I was a successful narcotics smuggler for years. But a lot of these people were caught because, you know, they were with their girlfriend in a park and they had a gram in their shoe, or they had an ounce of pot in their shoe. They got tortured to say they were taking it back to the States to sell it. They signed the confession. They had 632 confessions to show the United States because Nixon had given the Mexican government $25 million for something he called Operation Cooperation, which was to stop all the heroin trafficking, the war on drugs, right? So the Mexicans figured out that if they just made everybody sign confessions, here's our statistics. We arrested 636, we got 632 convictions. These are all drug smugglers. They were just kids. I had more drugs in my bust than all the rest of them put together.
Wow.
So we started, and I had money because I was pretty successful for years.
I mean, you were making like $1 million a year, right?
So I started writing articles that were put out in full-page ads in newspapers, open letter to the American public, open letter to the American president, you know, that there's human rights violations going on, not in the Middle East, 18 miles south of San Diego. People are being tortured. Now, at the same time, there was every time that anybody was arrested, the American embassy would come, and then they would get the information, and they would notify these 21, 22-year-old kids. They would notify their parents in the States. You know, your child was busted in Mexico. Oh, what do we do? Well, we have Mexican attorneys we recommend, and if you talk with them on the phone, you know, they're legitimate, good attorneys. They can help out. And so these people, whether they had money or they didn't have money, if they didn't have money, they might take a second mortgage on their home. They would fly down there, and they would give the Mexican attorney, say, $20,000, $25,000. Mexican attorney would split it with the U.S. embassy official. Nobody got out. So we were saying, not that up front, but we were saying that there were human rights violations and people were being tortured to sign confessions and extorted in prison. And so they finally, because these parents that were going down there also had congressmen, Peter Stark from Los Angeles was one who said, what? And he came down and looked into it. And there started to become momentum around it. So when we would smuggle out, like, you know, I would ask my wife to take the article and put it inside of her, and she would smuggle it out. And then it would be printed in the Washington Post or the Chicago Tribune.
Wow.
So we were gathering some momentum. And to make a long story short, one day, I get called into the warden's office at 1 a.m, and he's telling me in Spanish, 60 minutos aquí. What? 60 minutes? 60 minutes was there, coming to do a story on the Mexican and North American prisoners in Mexico.
Wow.
And so the Attorney General met with me in the morning, previous to having Dan Rather come in, and said to me, listen, we'd like you to be one. There was another guy, too, that was a representative, James, and me and him were going to go in with the Attorney General and represent all the Americans incarcerated in Mexico. And he said, we don't want to talk about the torture. Did you ever have any problems while you were here? No, it just cost me, a few $100,000 while I've been in prison, but no torture. That was only the first week, right? Yes. So let's not talk about it. Let's talk about how the American government under Nixon paid the Mexican government to do this. And let's talk about a prisoner exchange where all of you would get sent back, and they would send back the same number of Mexicans to our country so people could serve their sentences close to their families. Okay. So we went in and did the 60 Minutes segment. And 3 days after the 60 Minutes segment, I was called in for my court case. And they ruled me to be absuelto. Absuelto is the term for innocent. And the guy I was with got 8 years.
Wow.
And 5 minutes after the gavel went down that I was released as innocent, 3 days after 60 Minutes was there, and I did what I did with the Attorney General. They released me, and as I was gathering whatever was left of what they arrested me with, which wasn't much, the phone rang in the administration office, and the secretary picks it up and goes, "It's for you." And he hands me the phone. It's the Attorney General of Mexico, Garcia Ramirez. And he said to me, "Oh, Arturo, I heard about your good fortune." 5 minutes after the gavel went down, he heard about my good fortune, and I was released. But they were supposed to extradite me to the United States because there was a grand jury that had convened, and I was being charged with racketeering, cocaine smuggling, and tax evasion. So I managed to pay the Mexican government $1,500 to let me go to the airport and take any flight I wanted to. 24 hours I had before they notified the American authorities that I was released. So I flew to Canada and started assuming a different identity and lived in Canada for a year until my young son broke his leg in the States, and I felt terrible that I couldn't be with my kid. And that's when I decided that, I was coming back and facing the music, whatever that was. And I came back to the United States, and then I actually began doing work with the government, kind of teaching them about how I smuggled so they would have a better opportunity of, thinking like an entrepreneurial person. Because the DEA, believe it or not, were brand new. And the DEA was formed out of the Tobacco and Alcohol Division. And when they hired DEA agents, the DEA agent I ended up working with, I said, "What'd you do before you were a DEA agent?" He said, "I was a repairman for IBM typewriters."
Wow.
I said, "How'd you become a DEA agent?" So I answered the classified ad in the Chicago Tribune. That's when I realized when you have somebody who has that type of mentality, trying to catch somebody who has a very entrepreneurial mind, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not really a contest.
Two totally different games.
It's a totally different thing. And so instead of giving up people that they hoped I would do, I introduced bigger things to them that they never really, you can't get back on a boat in Cartagena anymore without being searched. Stuff like that. Set up a jungle in Colombia that they could bust. It was the biggest bust they ever had that was in the cover of Time magazine that was really set up between me and my contacts in Colombia so that they could do a thing between the American government and the Colombian government and make a big, combined effort to stop the drug production of cocaine in Colombia. Things like that.
So were you able to get those charges thrown out in exchange for your services to the DEA?
No, but what I didn't know at the time was when I went to court, the prosecuting attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin, the prosecuting attorney had 7 more months left as the prosecuting attorney, and then he was going to become a junior partner in my attorney's law firm. I didn't know that. But when it was time for the judge, by the way, the judge in this case played handball with my attorney every week.
Wow. What are the odds of that?
So my attorney, who visited me in Mexican prison, told the judge when he played handball with him, I got this guy, you should see what they did to him. He's in this Mexican prison. I mean, it wasn't an exciting description. And so really the reality was that I was looked at as a guy who had paid my dues. It cost me my marriage. It cost me a lot of money. I think they felt like I had been through enough. And when the judge asked the prosecution what their recommendation was, I was never like a guy that was a badass criminal who had guns and threatened people and all that kind of, So the prosecution just said, we remain mute. And they gave me 2 years probation. And then I didn't know that, but 7 months later, the prosecuting attorney became a partner at my law firm. And if you think that I had learned my lesson by then, I was in Colombia about another 1.5 years later because some guy in San Francisco that I knew offered me $50,000 just to introduce him to my connections so he wouldn't get robbed or killed. So I was supposed to go to Colombia to introduce him, except he didn't show up. And he asked me if I would just take care of it. And he had already paid me the $50,000. So now I was down there with my girlfriend, and my girlfriend, who was a young, attractive blonde, I actually never did a cocaine buy because I really felt like we were going to rip me off. So it was very spooky. It wasn't my same connections. And so I didn't want to do the cocaine buy. So we took the $125,000 that I had to do the transaction, and I taped it on her body. And she flew back from Cartagena to Miami. Well, when they saw a young, good-looking blonde landing in Miami from Colombia, they had to take her into secondary, and she didn't check off on the flight where it gives you the customs card that says, are you carrying more than $10,000 in cash? She's checked no. So they were looking for drugs, but when they found $100,000 on her, she was in prison in the jail in Miami. I was still in Cartagena. And when she didn't call me after 3 or 4 days, I called my attorney in Milwaukee. He called Miami, found out she was in jail in Miami. They found $100,000. It's a federal crime. So who came down to represent her? None other than the former prosecutor who was prosecuting me.
Oh my gosh.
In Wisconsin. Now he's representing basically my girlfriend. And then I filed to get the money back saying, hey, it's not my fault. She checked no.
Were there moments where you saw yourself shifting, changing how you wanted to be as a person? Like you mentioned your son's leg injury. Like what ultimately ended up being the catalyst for you changing and kind of cleaning stuff up?
I just, I had been through so much of those types of stressful life activities, and I was just tired. I was tired of it, tired of the life I had led, and I really wanted to do something. I remember thinking in prison in Mexico, I had become so successful with so many adversaries. People trying to rip you off, kidnap your wife, arm rob you. Then you got the IRS, DEA, FBI, Interpol. Everybody's trying to. It'd be like if you were playing football on the field and you were all alone with the ball, and you had this whole group of people trying to stop you from getting to the goalpost. I remember having this vision, thinking, "What if I was doing something that nobody was trying to stop me? If I was this successful at this age, doing something where so many people were trying to stop me, if I was doing something that was good for humanity," which actually I thought cocaine was in the early years, but now I realized narcotic smuggling wasn't viewed that way. And after that, I had been through everything I'd been through and lost my marriage through it, and I wanted to do something different, and I didn't know what that was. But coming back to face the music because my son had a broken leg and I wanted to be his dad. I didn't want to be living under an assumed name in a foreign country. I loved my son and I wanted to be a dad. So I figured if I have to do a few years in prison here, I'll do a few years in prison. I didn't know that there would be the result of being on probation for 2 years. I didn't know any of that. I came back ready to face whatever happened so that I could get it done. And that was the beginning, I think, of the shift. Well, first of all, when you're picking up all the restaurant tabs for your friends and acting like a rock star, it's pretty good to be a criminal. Crime pays. When you're in a Mexican prison being tortured and being considered to be the lowlife narcotic smuggler that you are, then, I saw that being a criminal really wasn't something that, other guys that were in prison there, this wasn't their first time in prison. I talked to a guy, Richie Messina from New York, shot 5 times trying to rob the Bronx Zoo on a Friday night. And he had been in prison out of his adult life. He was like 35 years old. He was in prison more years than he was out. And I said to him, Richie, he had a great sense of humor too, Richie. I said, Richie, did it ever occur to you that you're not too good at this crime thing? He said, what do you want me to do, open a flower store? I said, Richie, there's a lot in between a flower store and the kind of crime, armed robbery at Bronx Zoo. He was smuggling cocaine with a Colombian woman named Tatiana who had breasts that were 44D. Like, didn't you think they were going to look?
Yeah.
So when you're in jail with guys like that I was in jail with guys that were cartel, the cartels were just forming. And I was in with big cartel leaders. These guys, they would do a year, 2 years, they'd get out. And when you were in Mexican prison, if you had money, it could be a pretty good life. It wasn't, after the interrogations and the extortion and all that went down, with money, it wasn't that bad unless you got killed. But other than that, I wanted to do something different. And eventually, because I was a martial artist, I knew about acupuncture. I knew about acupuncture because when I studied, even as a teenager, martial arts, if somebody got hurt, like in training, my sensei would come out, Grandmaster G, and he'd come out with these acupuncture needles and he'd acupuncture you. Like if you got thrown too hard, because there wasn't always mats. Sometimes it was just a concrete floor or wood. And if you hurt yourself, he'd come out and do acupuncture. And so I saw it from 16, 17 years old. And when I read some article in like a magazine, a health and wellness magazine, about acupuncture schools, there was a few acupuncture schools in the United States. And there was one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I thought, I got to go check it out. So I actually flew to Santa Fe and shadowed the Chinese master, the Chinese acupuncturist. He was a medical doctor from China, didn't speak much English. And he gave me a chance to enroll in the school, even though I didn't have the degree. You were supposed to have the 4 years of college, but I didn't have that. But because I knew a little bit of how to act and a little bit of Chinese from my martial arts, he accepted me, and I also was able to write the full tuition check. So I
That
got
helps.
in, and I told my friends, we were buying real estate 'cause I still had a lot of money. So we were investing in real estate, me and a couple of guys. And I said, I'm going to Santa Fe to study acupuncture. And they looked at me like something was wrong with me. And I did. I went there in 3 years, had 2 kids, 2 more children, 2 more boys, and became an acupuncturist, started treating people out of my house for $30, $35 a treatment, and never, just stuck with it for 37 years.
Mm-hmm.
Treated thousands and probably at least a couple 100,000 treatments that I conducted, and ended up to have a very successful practice and helped a lot of people,
What do you
coached a lot of people.
coach a lot of people? What do you think it was about acupuncture that drew you to do it? Because like you said, you still had a lot of money. You could have just gone with your buddies and invested in real estate and done really well. You clearly already had this business mindset. What was it about acupuncture that just kind of drew you in to really pursue that?
That's a great question. There used to be a TV show on in the 60s, maybe early 70s, called Gung Fu. You could probably find it if you Google it. It was with David Carradine. And it was about a guy who was this Shaolin priest who, was a deadly guy, but also it was all about a guy who was a healer. And he had a little satchel of like herbs in his thong necklace or whatever. And it was this cool guy. It just went from town to town, kind of like a nomad. He was wanted in China for killing somebody who killed his teacher. So they were looking for him, and that was kind of the baseline of the story. But anyway, the thing about being a healer and wanting to serve, for some reason, which I can't explain intellectually, just resonated with me. I wanted to be able to help people, and I had a 10th grade education, so I wasn't going to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
And because I was accepted by this Chinese doctor, I guess I felt like, wow, this is a real opportunity coming my way. And an opportunity is only an opportunity if you can see it. If you don't get it, it's not much of an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I just left the properties that I owned with my 2 other partners. One was a real estate broker and one was an attorney. And I moved to Santa Fe and enrolled in this school. And it was a completely different scene. All these really, really nice people, really nice. There was nobody who was a cartel guy. There was, nobody who killed other people. These were just all these really nice people, and they all just wanted to serve and help other people. And it resonated with me. I don't know if you ever travel out into another country or been into another culture. Mm-hmm. Like I've spent time in Thailand. I've spent time in Southeast Asia. And there's a thread of respect. There's a thread of gratitude between human beings that somehow, felt good to me. And I always thought to myself, I'd like to try to retain this feeling, mm-hmm. like in Thailand or Bali, Indonesia, where people were just so kind and so wonderful, so respectful. That's not the way I grew up. I grew up that if we were friends, we usually were friends because we saw things the same way. We agreed on stuff, and everybody else was just a mark. Everybody else was an idiot. We know what's going on, but those people... and here, it was something else that resonated with me about humanity and people. And I just thought, this acupuncture has been around 5,000 years. The Asian cultures aren't stupid.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be doing it continuously now, intermingled with other Western methods, if it wasn't effective. And so I just thought, I want to learn this. I thought I could do it. Mm. And I made that commitment. And once I had the intention and made the commitment and made the move, it also got me away from all the old relationships, all the old temptations. Like the DEA kept trying to get me involved in more stuff. I was done with all that, and I just submerged myself into a completely different culture of people that brought out the more, I guess, caring, empathetic, compassionate things in me. And when I worked with people in my practice, all my background was powerful. Because, for example, I had a woman that came in, couldn't sleep, gained a lot of weight, was on clonazepam, which is like a Valium, a tranquilizer, sleeping pills. I'm like, 60-year-old woman. She's like, my son, he's been stealing from me for a long time and buying cocaine. And he finally got busted, and he's going to be going to court, and he's going to go to jail. And I said to her, great. How old's your son? 22. Great. She's looking at me like, the fuck you talking about, great? I said, I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't been busted for cocaine and gone to jail. That's the opportunity. Because if he didn't go to jail and he's using cocaine and he's dealing cocaine, there's no shot. There's no shot. This is his shot. This is a blessing. And I just remember that time and what that woman's face changed dramatically. And she didn't know anything about me. And then I started sharing, with people if they were going through difficult transitions in their life, whether it be divorce, people who were going to lose their jobs because of a merger, people, and because I had experienced both the mental emotional pain, the desperation, the anxiety, physical pain of being tortured, people came to me and, had a laminectomy and a fusion and were on prednisone for 8 years, had no more bone left in their body. Now they wanted to build a cage around their spine. And now they were coming for acupuncture. And I would think, I don't know what I can do to help, but I did my best. And then after 2 or 3 treatments, they'd say, it's amazing. I'm 75% different. It was really powerful. Acupuncture is very powerful. And, they call it a practice because you're learning. And as the years go on, you continually get better if you're fortunate enough to have a larger practice where you see a lot of people. Then you'll see a lot of ulcerative colitis. You'll see a lot of back pain. You'll see a lot of something. And I was fortunate. I've always been fortunate. I've always had a fortunate life. And not that it happened overnight. I mean, it took 10 years, 15 years before really having that big of a practice. But when you're seeing 40 people a day, you're helping a lot of people.
Yeah.
How much of your healing was being able to speak into certain instances where people were dealing with, whether it's life things or physical things, and just give them hope and that belief that they can really change through this modality?
That's the purpose of the book. The book, Poison for Rats, the intention I had when I wrote that book wasn't, I understood that there was a lot of people who could not relate to somebody who smuggled drugs. They could not relate to someone who was in prison in Mexico or tortured or whatever. But the transitions that I went through in my life, everybody goes through transitions. Everybody goes through difficult times. You don't have to be those exact experiences. And the point of writing the book was that life can change on a dime. No matter what's going, when they were torturing me, electrocuting me, and beating me, do you think someone coming up to me and saying to me, someday this is all going to be a benefit to you. This is a real blessing, Art. Right? No, there's no way, because I thought I was going to die. But when people would say to me, I've had acupuncture treatments for a year, and I didn't get the results I got from you in this one treatment, or these 2 treatments, or this, I would say to myself, they must have been seeing an idiot. I don't know. I mean, I didn't acknowledge myself and really give myself the kind of respect. I just didn't, because I've been a hustler my whole life. And the experience I had treating people over and over again after many years, it was really not even that. I got to become more comfortable in my skin as a healer, but it was through writing the book. Writing the book was the therapy. Writing the book got me to really understand who I am and who I was and who I became, and take some credit for it. But I think that my hopes were that people reading the book would be able to come to the conclusion that no matter how you feel right now, there's always something better. Change is always provides something better for the most part. And that was my hopes and intention of writing the book. I didn't know it was going to be that long of a process or that big of a story, but really that's what I think my life turned into. Was I became someone who could help other people, which is really what I was hoping for when I brought back cocaine. You know, in the early stages, people would feel better as individuals. Then they'd get a better car. I'd front them some cocaine. Then they'd get a better apartment. Then they'd have, you know, better lifestyle before it all kind of turned to the dark side. And I really think that I've always wanted to help people, and I've always wanted to be acknowledged by people and feel that thread of humanity I spoke about. So I still like to help people, and I still do help people. I do acupuncture on people, but now it's not as many people. I don't have a large clinic anymore. I see people out of my home. I do coaching work with people on Zoom from all over that are going through difficult things, whether it be whatever it is. And so I kind of still enjoy being able to help people and being thanked for it. I do a lot of mentoring. That's what it's all come to. And dog walking.
And dog walking. You do it all.
I do mentoring and dog walking.
Yeah.
When you think about time, looking back on your experience, how quickly or does it surprise you that you got wrapped up in stuff like that, and like how quickly some of that stuff happened when you look back on it? Like, as in like the drug smuggling, like, did you even really, I guess, realize at the time, like, how much of that of your life would be taken up by some of that?
No, I really, no. I just wasn't that insightful. I just wanted to, it sounded like, you know, like the Soldiers of Fortune show I used to watch, or Flash Gordon as a kid that was 8 years old. It was just something I felt like I don't want to be a furniture salesman like my dad. I don't want to be like some of the kids in school that were sitting next to me. What do you want to be, Ted? I want to be a fireman. What do you want to be, Ralph? I want to be a police officer. Then they'd ask me, what do you want to be, Art? And I said, I want to be Emperor of Mong. Why? Because on Mongo, he could do anything he wanted to. He was Emperor Ming. I wanted to be Emperor of Earth. And then they'd put me in the principal's office, say, look, you know, this kid's a problem kid. So, no, I didn't really realize that. I had no idea. But I've done a lot of other things, too. I mean, besides what we've talked about, I've done organizational leadership development in corporations, which was a strange fluke because I had met Stephen Covey. You know who Stephen Covey?
Yeah.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People. When his book was first published, he gave me the state of Wisconsin. I had met him. He liked me, and he said, I want you to represent my work here. So now I was in front of corporate leaders presenting his work through a video course that he had done. But then I had one of the people in the audience ask me to come in and do some other work that I had to develop the coursework myself. And that just came out of the blue. And when they hired me as an organizational development consultant, they thought Dr. Arthur Rapkin, because I have a doctorate in Chinese medicine. So they thought I had a doctorate in organizational development. They didn't know I was an acupuncturist. So here I am standing up there presenting work that I developed in the communications field. I called one of my courses The Spirit of Dialogue and sold it for $386,000. And then another company bought it, and another company bought it, and it was like $1 million in the first year. It was crazy. I had no training in it whatsoever, but I had some, it was like an allure to me. And again, I think I wanted to just help people. And like Stephen Covey's work, The 7 Habits, kind of like the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
That was one of the leadership exercises I used to do in the corporate world. I'd have a room full of people. I'd say, how many people here have ever heard of the 10 Commandments? Every hand went up. I'd say, okay, get into groups of 3. The first group that can list them in order, raise your hand. Nobody listed them in order. The 10 Commandments. Something that everybody knew, everybody probably acknowledged and thought, these are good commandments. But nobody really could name them all, let alone put them in order, except one guy who was the head of the nuclear power plant in Wisconsin, who went to a Catholic school and was beaten with rulers until they mentioned the 10 Commandments in order every morning. He was the only guy that knew the 10 Commandments. Here I was as a consultant in the nuclear power plant, where you have to have top security clearance. They investigate your background. So I did some other things.
Yeah.
Besides, I was a hairdresser.
Women's hair or men's hair?
Huh?
Did you cut men's hair or women's hair?
No. I went to hairdressing school because I wanted to meet women.
Yeah.
So I figured, how do you meet women? I went to hairdressing school.
You're a smart man.
Yeah, and then when you go out at night, you don't go out at night looking to meet women. You go out at night with 6 other girls that you work with. And you don't have to go home wondering who you're going home with, because you go home with 2 or 3 of the girls, and in the morning they're making omelets. So I did that. And I was never a good hairdresser because I didn't know how to dress hair. Like if a woman came in with really long hair and they were going to a wedding and they wanted it to be done in a special, no. But with the scissors, I was pretty good.
You were good.
Everybody got short hair.
Yeah. I liked what you were saying about how writing the book itself was like cathartic in your ability to really reflect on all these different things that have happened that maybe you had bottled up over the years, but there's something about writing that just really crystallizes your thoughts in a way that nothing else does. And, I think that as humans, we're so attracted and drawn to these people with amazing transformational stories similar to yourself. Like, I think that's partially why Apostle Paul is such a huge figure in Christianity, because, he was the worst of the worst, persecuting and killing Christians, had his transformation, and now he's written I think it's 2/3 of the New Testament. That's a powerful story through that transformation. So I think your ability to be vulnerable and share those experiences and those learnings and teach people that they too can transform, like you did for that woman with her son that was facing those drug charges. Like, we're just kind of drawn to the ability to be vulnerable and show other people that you can transform too.
It took me a long time to really realize how connected we all are. Because there was a large portion of time in my life that I was pursuing, more and more. I wanted more, and there was not enough. And now, as I look back, I realize none of that really mattered.
Mm-hmm.
What matters are the things that we're probably taught, if we're lucky as kids, about caring for other people and kindness, relationships, not how much money your business made and how successful you are by what kind of vehicle you had. And I had 3 houses, 4 houses at a time, different parts of the country, a Rolls Royce, a driver, that is not, as I look back, what made any difference. My practice, which became huge, wouldn't have made any difference if it would have been a small practice. I still raised my 2 kids and, didn't have the kind of big money that I had in the old days. And as long as you have a good relationship with people you care about, and the more people that you make connections with, the richer your life is. Not that people don't count if they don't think like you, or that, becoming so self-important that other people are less important. I don't know how that all, I think when I hung out with those mentors in the Big Boy restaurant and, the siding agents and the con artists, that like one of my friends was Ronald McDonald, who was a carny. And he was raised on the carnival, and then he got the job as Ronald McDonald when they first hired a clown, corporate McDonald's. And he used to talk about, in the carnival world, there's the carnies and then there's the marks. And the marks were the people that came to watch the fat lady or, the sword swallower or whatever. And the guy who was selling the tickets was standing on a higher stoop. And so he would be able to look down, and then they'd have people in the crowd who would see when someone went into their wallet or pulled out their money to buy the ticket, and they would come by and touch them on the back like, yeah, And they didn't know, but they had a chalk mark. They did a chalk mark so that the pickpockets would be able to know who to pickpocket during the show. And that's how the term marks came to be. They were marks. So, I was raised in a group like that where people, the scammers, the hustlers, and then everybody else was a mark. If you go through life like that, you're missing out.
Yeah.
And I really didn't get it till much later in my life, but thank God I got it. Because I still have, the opportunity to be able to do things that I consider to be good things, valuable things, helping other people, whatever I can do.
Yeah. What's the best way for people to get a copy of your book or connect with you further if they want to learn more about your story?
Well, the book is available on the publisher's website, which is called Beyond the Streets. Beyond the Streets is primarily produces art books, table books, but the publisher really thought highly of my story and wanted to do the first memoir. It's also it's going to be a TV series. A television producer named Kelly Sodders is a very successful TV producer, got a copy of the book and decided she wanted to make it into a series, which I think would be a wonderful thing because I think the story has a lot of legs. And who knows what they're going to do with it. But the way to get the book would be to go to Beyond the Streets and order it. There's about 150 pages of photographs and documentation. There's a lot of musicians in there, me with Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, Stevie Winwood, when I was in my music days. There's all kinds of documentation, posters of the Bob Dylan concert, when I was supposed to fight the bull, newspaper articles. So you can actually pick the book up and just look through it and be like, I can't believe this. Even though it's all there, it's still unbelievable. And when I think back at it, it seems kind of unbelievable even to me. I don't get out much anymore.
Yeah, you've done enough.
So cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This is awesome.
Thanks
really
for
appreciate
having
you
me.
sharing with our audience, and I know they're going to love it. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.